In modern Japan, the idea seems impossible. A police detective walking into a known Yakuza headquarters for a cup of tea. An organized crime boss handing his business card to a cop on the street. Yet, for decades, this was the reality. The relationship between the Yakuza and the Japanese police was not a secret war fought in the shadows. It was an open, complex, and often strangely public affair. Yakuza groups weren't just criminal gangs. They were registered entities with offices, logos, and even fan magazines. Their headquarters were listed in phone books. The police knew exactly where to find them because the Yakuza wanted to be found. This wasn't a sign of weakness on either side. It was the foundation of a long-standing, unwritten agreement. This arrangement was built on a shared understanding of order. The police, often understaffed and overwhelmed, saw the Yakuza as a tool to manage the unruly elements of society. The Yakuza in turn understood that their survival depended on not crossing certain lines. They were expected to keep petty crime, like street muggings and random violence, off their turf. If a tourist got their wallet stolen in a Yakuza-controlled district, the local boss might get a visit from a detective. The message was clear. Handle it, or we will. This system created a strange kind of stability. The Yakuza were the unofficial janitors of the underworld, cleaning up the messes that the police couldn't or wouldn't touch. For the average citizen, this meant that certain parts of the city, while seedy, were surprisingly safe. You could walk through a red light district like Kabukicho late at night without fearing a random attack. The criminal element was present, but it was organized and predictable. The police tolerated Yakuza gambling dens, prostitution rings, and protection rackets because these activities were contained. The violence was usually internal between rival gangs and rarely spilled over to affect ordinary people. This unspoken agreement was a delicate dance. It required constant communication and a mutual respect for boundaries, even between sworn enemies. It was a system of managed chaos, not total lawlessness. The police had dedicated divisions known as the Marubo, a slang term for Boryokudan investigators, who specialized in organized crime. These detectives knew the gang bosses by name. They knew their family members, their routines, and their business interests. They would attend Yakuza funerals and weddings, not as guests, but as observers, gathering intelligence and showing their presence. This direct contact allowed the police to keep a finger on the pulse of the underworld. They could anticipate gang wars, mediate disputes, and ensure that the violence didn't spiral out of control. It was a relationship built not on trust, but on a pragmatic recognition of each other's existence and power. Why would a modern, developed nation tolerate organized crime? The answer lies in a uniquely Japanese form of pragmatism. For much of the 20th century, the police viewed the Yakuza as a necessary evil, or hitsuyo aku. The logic was simple. It is better to deal with a structured, hierarchical organization than a chaotic swarm of independent criminals. The Yakuza provided a single point of contact. If a problem arose, the police knew who to call. This was far more efficient than trying to hunt down countless petty thieves, drug dealers, and extortionists who answered to no one. The Yakuza enforced their own brand of brutal street justice, which kept the lower levels of the criminal world in check. This system also served a social function. The Yakuza often recruited from the margins of society, individuals who struggled to find a place in Japan's rigid social structure. By providing them with an identity and a sense of belonging, the gangs absorbed a population that might otherwise have caused more widespread social disruption. The police understood this. They knew that smashing the Yakuza entirely could unleash a wave of unpredictable street crime as thousands of disenfranchised men were left with no income and no loyalties. Tolerating the gangs was seen as the lesser of two evils. It was a way of containing a problem, not solving it. Furthermore, the Yakuza's business activities were for a long time in a legal gray area. They operated in industries like entertainment, real estate, and loan services. While their methods were often predatory, the businesses themselves were not always explicitly illegal. This made prosecution difficult. The Yakuza were masters at exploiting legal loopholes. They presented themselves as legitimate corporations, even while engaging in classic racketeering behind the scenes. The police, bound by the rules of evidence and due process, couldn't always build a strong enough case to shut them down. So, they focused on managing them instead. This created a feedback loop of mutual dependence. The police relied on the Yakuza to maintain a certain kind of order, and the Yakuza relied on police tolerance to survive. This wasn't friendship, it was a cold, calculated balance of power. The police set the boundaries, and the Yakuza learned not to overstep them. For example, dealing hard drugs like heroin or meth was often a red line. While some gangs dabbled in it, the major syndicates knew that a full-scale narcotics operation would bring the full weight of the law down on them. They stuck to their traditional rackets, gambling, prostitution, and protection money, mikajimerio, which the police were more likely to overlook. The roots of this strange relationship go back to the chaos of post-World War II Japan. The country was in ruins, the government was in disarray, and the police force was weak and demoralized. Into this vacuum stepped the Yakuza. They provided services that the state could not. They managed black markets, which were essential for the distribution of scarce goods like food and medicine. They protected local communities from foreign soldiers and rogue elements. In a time of profound uncertainty, the Yakuza offered a semblance of order and stability. The Allied occupation forces, led by the Americans, initially tried to crack down on them, but soon realized they needed their help. The Yakuza became useful partners for the authorities in another way, fighting communism. During the Cold War, Japan was a key strategic ally for the United States in Asia. The government was deeply concerned about the rise of left-wing student movements and powerful labor unions. The Yakuza, being fiercely nationalistic and anti-communist, were hired as muscle. They acted as strikebreakers, intimidating union organizers and clashing with student protesters. This political usefulness earned them a degree of protection from the government and the police. They were seen as a bulwark against a greater ideological threat. This period cemented the Yakuza's position in Japanese society. They weren't just criminals, they were patriots in their own eyes, performing a service for the country. This self-image was crucial. It allowed them to justify their existence and gain a measure of public acceptance. They weren't just preying on society, they were a part of it. This history of cooperation, born from the ashes of war and the anxieties of the Cold War, created a deep and lasting bond with the conservative political establishment and, by extension, the police. The lines between law enforcement, politics, and organized crime became incredibly blurry. Of course, this cooperation was never official policy. It was a series of informal deals and backroom handshakes. But it set a precedent that would last for decades. The police learned that they could use the Yakuza to achieve certain goals. The Yakuza learned that as long as they served a purpose and didn't cause too much trouble for the general public, they would be left alone. This post-war pragmatism laid the groundwork for the system of managed crime that would define the relationship between cops and gangsters for the next 50 years. It was a messy, compromised, but functional solution to the problems of a nation in crisis. Nowhere was this system of managed crime more visible than in Tokyo's Kabukicho district. For decades, this famous red light area was a perfect case study in police-Yakuza coexistence. The district was carved up by several different Yakuza families, each controlling their own slice of territory. They ran the bars, the clubs, the gambling parlors, and the prostitution rackets. And the police at the local Shinjuku station knew everything. They had maps detailing which gang controlled which block. They knew the names of the bosses, the enforcers, and the front men. The Yakuza didn't hide. Their offices were marked with their crests, or daimon, and their members walked the streets openly. The police practice here was one of direct monitoring. Detectives would make regular patrols, not to make arrests, but to gather information and make their presence felt. They would drop by a Yakuza office for a chat, asking about recent tensions or new faces in the neighborhood. This constant low-level contact was a form of pressure. It reminded the gangs that they were being watched. It also provided the police with a steady stream of intelligence. If a gang war was brewing, the police would often know about it before the first punch was thrown. They could then step in to mediate, calling the rival bosses for a sit-down to cool things off. This model created a predictable criminal environment. The Yakuza's main goal was to make money, and open warfare was bad for business. They had an incentive to keep the peace. Their role was to ensure that the crime within their territory was profitable and, most importantly, contained. They would chase out freelance criminals, unaffiliated drug dealers, muggers, and rapists, because these individuals brought unwanted police attention and scared away customers. In a strange way, the Yakuza acted as the unofficial security force for their own illegal enterprises, and the police allowed it because it made their jobs easier. This delicate balance was demonstrated whenever a serious crime against a civilian occurred. For example, if a tourist was robbed or assaulted, the police would put immense pressure on the Yakuza family, controlling that territory. The message was simple. This is your turf. Find the person responsible, or we will shut down your businesses one by one. The Yakuza, not wanting to lose their income, would usually comply. They would use their network of informants to identify the culprit and either turn them over to the police or deal with them internally. This system, while morally ambiguous, was highly effective at keeping random, violent street crime to a minimum. The era of cozy coexistence could not last forever. By the 1960s, the Yakuza had grown so powerful and brazen that, well, public sentiment began to turn against them. Gang wars were becoming more frequent and more violent, sometimes even spilling into public spaces. The police, under pressure from the media and the public, realized they had to act. This led to a series of major police crackdowns, known as the Summit Operations, or. The goal here wasn't to eradicate the Yakuza entirely, but to dismantle the largest and most powerful syndicates, primarily the Yamaguchi-gumi, and reassert police authority. It was a clear signal that the balance of power had shifted just a bit too far. The Summit Operations marked a dramatic change in tactics. Instead of quiet monitoring, the police launched aggressive, high-profile raids. They arrested top-level bosses on any charge they could find, from illegal gambling to firearms possession. They also targeted the Yakuza's sources of income, shutting down front companies and seizing assets. These operations were a show of force, really designed to break the myth of Yakuza invincibility. For the first time, the police were treating the Yakuza not as partners in maintaining order, but as a cancer on society that needed, well, to be surgically cut down to size. Even during these crackdowns, though, the old habits of communication died hard. In some cases, police would still mediate peace treaties between warring gangs. They would broker deals where one gang would agree to withdraw from a territory, or another would promise to cease hostilities. Sometimes gang leaders would be required to submit written promises, or pledging to keep the peace. These documents were mostly symbolic, but they demonstrated the ongoing need for dialogue. The police understood that a purely confrontational approach could lead to an all-out war, which would be far more destructive for society. They still needed the Yakuza to police themselves, even as they were arresting their leaders. The Summit Operations ultimately succeeded in weakening the major syndicates for a time. But they did not destroy them. The Yakuza proved to be resilient. They adapted, restructured, and eventually grew back. What these operations did achieve was a recalibration of the relationship. They sent a clear message to the Yakuza. There are limits. The police, when pushed, would use their full power. The era of open tolerance was beginning to fade, replaced by a more cautious and confrontational dynamic. The handshake was still there, but now it was backed by the threat of a clenched fist. The real earthquake that shattered the traditional world of the Yakuza and the police was the Act for Prevention of Unlawful Activities by Boryokudan members, passed in 1991. Commonly known as the Botaiho or Anti-Boryokudan Law, this legislation changed everything. Before this law, being a Yakuza member was not illegal. Their organizations were not banned. The police had to catch them in the act of committing a specific crime, like extortion or assault. The Botaiho flipped the script. It allowed the police to officially designate major gangs as Boryokudan, or violent groups. Once designated, their members were forbidden from engaging in a wide range of activities that were central to their business. This new law made many traditional Yakuza activities illegal simply because they were being done by a designated gang member. For example, demanding protection money, aggressively collecting debts, or intervening in civil disputes became specific offenses under the Botaiho. The law gave police the power to issue cease and desist orders. If a Yakuza member violated that order, they could be arrested, even if their actions wouldn't have been a crime for an ordinary citizen. This was a revolutionary tool for the police. It allowed them to attack the Yakuza's business model directly, without needing to prove a more serious underlying crime. The impact on the police-Yakuza relationship was immediate and profound. the era of open communication was over. A detective could no longer casually drop by a Yakuza office for a chat. Under the new law, such contact could be seen as consorting with criminals. The clear line that the law drew between legal and illegal made the old grey area of mutual understanding untenable. The police were now legally mandated to be adversaries, not pragmatic managers. The informal channels of communication that had been used for decades to mediate disputes and gather intelligence were shut down. For the Yakuza, the law was a disaster. It made it difficult to recruit new members, as the risks became much higher. It made it harder to run their traditional rackets, and it drove a wedge between them and the society they once claimed to be a part of. Businesses were forbidden from knowingly dealing with Yakuza, and landlords could evict them from their offices. The Yakuza were officially labeled as social outcasts. The law was designed to isolate them, to cut off their sources of income, and to make it impossible for them to operate in the open. The dance between cops and gangsters was over. A new kind of war had begun. The anti-Boryokuden law and a series of subsequent ordinances had their intended effect. They forced the Yakuza out of the public eye. The flashy suits, the visible tattoos, and the crest-marked headquarters began to disappear. The gangs could no longer operate openly. They had to go underground. This created a new and more difficult challenge for the police. When the Yakuza were visible, they were predictable. The police knew who the players were and where to find them. Now the gangs were becoming invisible, morphing into something harder to track and control. The Marubo detectives could no longer rely on street-level contacts and direct observation. In response, police tactics had to evolve. The focus shifted from monitoring to investigation. Instead of managing the gangs, the police were now tasked with dismantling them. This required a move towards more sophisticated, covert methods. Wiretapping, undercover operations, and long-term financial investigations became the new tools of the trade. The police had to learn to fight an enemy they could no longer see clearly. They had to trace complex money laundering schemes that funneled cash through legitimate-looking front companies. The fight moved from the streets of Kabukicho to the boardrooms and bank accounts of corporate Japan. This new underground environment also created a more dangerous criminal landscape. As the traditional Yakuza syndicates weakened, a new breed of criminal emerged. These were the hangara, semi-organized groups of thugs who lacked the hierarchy, discipline, and code of conduct of the old Yakuza. They were more violent, more unpredictable, and had no interest in maintaining order. They engaged in brazen scams, home invasions, and random acts of violence that the traditional Yakuza would never have tolerated. For the police, this was a nightmare. They were now fighting a war on two fronts, against the remnants of the old Yakuza, and against a new chaotic generation of criminals. The Yakuza themselves adapted to this new reality. They shed the outward trappings of their identity and embedded themselves deeper into the legitimate economy. They became involved in complex financial fraud, stock market manipulation, and cybercrime. They created shell corporations and used professional lawyers and accountants to hide their activities. This made them much harder to prosecute. A Yakuza boss no longer looked like a gangster, he looked like a CEO. The police were forced to become experts in white-collar crime, a far cry from the old days of mediating street brawls. The war had become smarter, quieter, and arguably more insidious. Even with powerful laws and modern tactics, the police in Japan today still face a dilemma. Why don't they just smash the remaining Yakuza groups completely? One major reason is the fear of what comes next. As mentioned, the decline of the traditional Yakuza has led to the rise of the more volatile hangure. The police understand that if they completely eliminate the remaining Yakuza structure, they might unleash a far greater and more chaotic wave of crime. The old Yakuza bosses, for all their faults, still exert some control over their members. Without that hierarchy, thousands of criminals would be left to their own devices, creating a public safety nightmare that the police are ill-equipped to handle. Another significant challenge is the difficulty of prosecution. Modern Yakuza have become masters of plausible deniability. The bosses are insulated by layers of subordinates and front companies. Proving in court that a specific crime was ordered by the man at the top is incredibly difficult. Japanese law has a high standard of evidence, and prosecutors are often reluctant to take on cases they are not certain to win. This means that while police can arrest low-level foot soldiers, Taking down the entire leadership of a syndicate remains a monumental task. The Yakuza have learned to use the legal system to their advantage, tying up police resources in long, expensive court battles. There is also a resource issue. A full-scale war on the Yakuza would require an enormous investment of police manpower, time, and money. It would mean dedicating thousands of officers to long-term surveillance, financial analysis, and undercover work. These are resources that are already stretched thin, dealing with other forms of crime, from traffic accidents to cyber attacks. For many police departments, it is simply more practical to contain the Yakuza problem, rather than attempt to eradicate it. They focus on preventing major outbreaks of violence and targeting the most blatant criminal activities, while accepting that a low level of organized crime will likely persist. Finally, some elements of the old pragmatism remain, albeit in a much more limited form. While direct communication is now forbidden, informal information channels have not disappeared entirely. There is still a recognition that some level of awareness of the underworld's activities is better than none. The police need informants, and sometimes the best informants are those within the criminal organizations themselves. This creates a delicate balancing act. The police must enforce the law aggressively, but they must also cultivate sources and maintain a level of intelligence that would be impossible in a state of total, blind warfare. The dance, though changed, has not ended completely. The long and complicated relationship between the Yakuza and the Japanese police has never been a simple story of good versus evil. It has always been a complex dance of pragmatism, power, and public safety. For decades, it was a partnership of convenience, a system of managed crime that kept the streets relatively safe at a significant moral cost. The police tolerated the Yakuza's existence in exchange for a predictable and controllable underworld. This unspoken agreement, born from the ashes of war and solidified during the Cold War, defined Japanese society for half a century. It was a relationship that was open, public, and understood by both sides. The anti-Boryokudan laws of the 1990s marked a definitive end to that era. The legal and social pressure forced the Yakuza into the shadows, transforming them from visible pariahs into invisible threats. This, in turn, forced a revolution in police tactics. The focus shifted from face-to-face monitoring to covert intelligence gathering, from managing street corners to tracking digital footprints. The police had to become as sophisticated as the criminals they were hunting. The old Marubo detective who knew every gangster by name was replaced by the analyst who could trace money through a dozen shell companies. Today, this evolution continues. The Yakuza are weaker than ever before, their numbers dwindling, their power waning. But they have not disappeared. They have adapted, moving into new realms of criminality like cybercrime and intricate financial fraud. The police, in turn, continue to adapt their methods, using technology and intelligence-led policing to stay one step ahead. The rise of the chaotic hangar gangs presents a new and unpredictable threat, reminding the authorities that the absence of the Yakuza does not necessarily mean the absence of crime. The fundamental dilemma remains: how to dismantle an organized evil without unleashing a disorganized one. The key lesson from this long history is that the relationship between law and order and organized crime is rarely black and white. It is a constantly shifting landscape of compromises, confrontations, and unintended consequences. The story of the Yakuza and the Japanese police is a powerful reminder that maintaining public safety is a messy and imperfect art. The old dance may be over, but a new, more complex one is being choreographed in the hidden spaces of the modern world, from shadowy back alleys to the dark corners of the internet. And for the safety of the public, it is a dance the police cannot afford to lose.